So now we talk about corticospinal tract. So this tract is also called medial pathway or the pyramidal tract because it forms a pyramid. So as the name suggests, corticospinal tract, and it is also called the motor tract. So it is one of the strongest tracts in the brain. So it starts from cortex and then goes all the way down to spinal cord. So cortex, as we know, there is a motor area in front of in the precentral gyrus. That's where the motor fibers arise, and they travel all the way down to the brainstem and then down onto the spinal cord. And up until the brainstem, they are going to be on the same side. At the brainstem, however, there is going to be decussation. So there is going to be the fibers are 90% of the fibers, or the 90% of the corticospinal tract is going to cross over to the opposite side, and that is called the decussation of the tract. So this thick tract from then onwards is going to move down to the spinal cord level. However, the remaining 10% is going to stay on the same side and will go on to form the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract of the same side. These fibers go down to the spinal cord, and at the level of the level where they distribute to the spinal nerves, these are also going to move on to the opposite side. So eventually, the entire corticospinal tract is going to provide motor fibers to the contralateral side of the body. So based upon this anatomy, we know that whenever there is a lesion up here in the cortex above the decussation, there is going to be weakness on the opposite side of the body, and whenever there is a lesion on the right side, there will be weakness on the left side. However, if there is a lesion below the decussation or below the medulla oblongata, then there will be same side weakness. So this information is very helpful to figure out where the lesion is. Now let's move on to the other tracts in the spinal cord. So we have a very important sensory tract which is called the dorsal column. So dorsal column carries sensation of position and vibration and fine touch from the skin and the tissue. So what's going to happen is the sensory nerves are going to start from the skin surface, and then information will be carried to the dorsal root ganglion here in the back of the nerve root, and then this information is going to be carried on to the dorsal column. And in the posterior or the dorsal end of the spinal cord, there is something called fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. So remember these two fancy terms. See, these fasciculi are going to carry information all the way up to the medulla, and these still are your first order neurons. So the first order neurons on to relay information to medulla, and that's where the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus live. And second order neuron from the nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis are going to arise and move on to the opposite side. So this is where the decussation happens. So decussation again here happens at the medulla level. Now these second order neurons go on to the opposite side and move up to thalamus. That's where they relay information one more time, and then the third order neuron, in a very hierarchical fashion, go on to relay information to the somatosensory cortex in the brain, and that's your postcentral gyrus. So remember, dorsal column is a 3-order neuron pathway. So the first order all the way up to the medulla, second order from medulla to the thalamus, and the third order from thalamus to the sensory cortex. And that is why we get information from the opposite side of the body, and that's where we become aware and we know what's happening if there is a change in pressure or vibration. Now if there is a lesion below the medulla, as you can see right here, then obviously there's going to be loss of position and sensation, vibration on the same side of the body, because it's obviously common sense. Now if there is a lesion above the medulla level, there will be loss of position vibration on the opposite side. Now let's talk about another tract, which is spinothalamic tract. So this is another very interesting tract. So it carries information of pain and temperature, which are very important sensations, from the surface of the skin and the tissue to the dorsal root ganglion here in the back of the spinal cord. From here, a Lasarus tract is formed, which moves on to the one spinal cord level above. So it's going to just move up just a little bit, and then this tract is going to go ahead and give rise to the second order neuron and decussate to the opposite side. So Lasarus tract decussates very quickly to the opposite side as opposed to the dorsal tract, and second order neuron goes up all the way to thalamus. So remember, the spinothalamic is going to move cross over to the opposite side very quickly, just one level above the level where the sensation was received, and the second order neuron is going to relay in thalamus, so it doesn't relay in medulla and it stays on the same side on medulla, and then the third order neuron from thalamus is going to go on to sensory cortex in the precentral gyrus. So this is how we become aware and we know there is pain or temperature problem. Again, as you can see in the brain, opposite side of the body is represented. So the left side of the brain is going to receive information from the right side, and the right from the left side. So if there is a lesion below the thalamus level, if there is a lesion anywhere in this tract, it's going to make you lose sensation of pain and temperature of the opposite side, because the decussation is happening at a very early level. Now here is a contrast between the dorsal column and the spinothalamic tract, and dorsal column is also called the medial meniscal pathway. So remember this name because we'll use it again. And as you can see, the contrast is between where they are decussating and also where the second and the third order neurons are generating. In the dorsal column tract, the second order is starting off from the medulla level, and in the spinothalamic tract, the second order is actually starting from the Lascaris tract. So this contrast is important, and also there are similarities. So these two tracts are very important. In comparison to these two, the corticospinal tract, remember, had only two order neurons. So the first order started from the cortex, and the second order started from the anterior horn cells in the spinal cord. So there are only two order neurons. All right, let's move on to different spinal cord lesions. So now we kind of have the anatomy of the spinal cord. So there is a very interesting phenomenon called Brown-Séquard syndrome, and this is hemichord lesion. So as you can see, it's very self-explanatory, and now we already know the anatomy. So just by looking at this picture, we know if there is a lesion on one side of the spinal cord, for example, if there is trauma or whatever, there is going to be the loss of pain and temperature sense on the opposite side. So there will be contralateral loss of pain and temperature sense, because we know spinothalamic crosses very quickly, but there will be loss of motor function and position vibration sense on the same side, because we know corticospinal, which was descending, which was the efferent pathway, had already decussated very in the medulla, and now there is going to be the same side, or the ipsilateral loss of motor function, but there will also be ipsilateral loss of vibration and position sense, because the dorsal column is still on the same side at this level. Okay, so I hope this was clear enough. Let's move on to the next lesion, which is anterior cord syndrome. This happens very commonly in the case of syringomyelia, and if there is a spinal artery infarct. So what's happening here is only the anterior cord of the anterior cord, or the anterior half of the spinal cord, is being affected. So this is the area of damage. So what's going to happen? Obviously, we know our anatomy. So the dorsal column is preserved. So everything is going to be okay there. The patient will be able to have position and vibration sense, but will not have any temperature or pain sensation, and there also is going to be complete loss of motor function. So this is complete paralysis on both sides. So now after the spinal cord lesions, we move on to the higher level. So we are talking about brainstem. So we all know the brainstem has midbrain, pons, and medulla, and we know there are cranial nerves that live there. This is the home to all the cranial nerves, with the exception of the first and the second. So these nerves nuclei are going to reside here. However, the fibers are going to arise from those nuclei and will travel too. So they're depending upon where the lesion is, we know what cranial nerve or the tract is going to be affected. So this can become very complicated very quickly, but I have a little simple formula here that I got from somewhere. So let's look at that. So the brainstem, in the brainstem you can use the rule of 4. So the rule of 4s has 3 rules in it. So the first rule is that cranial nerves live in the sets of 4s. So the first 4 are going to be above the pons. So the first and second above the brainstem, third and fourth in the midbrain, and 5, 6, 7, 8 are going to be in the pons, and 9, 10, 11, 12 are going to be here in the medulla down here. All right, now the second rule of 4 is that there are 4 midline structures that start with an M in the brainstem. So the first is medial pathway, which also remember we said was corticospinal pathway or the motor pathway. This is going to be in the midline. So if there is a lesion in the midline, guess what? This is going to be affected. And then the second is medial lemniscus, which is the dorsal column. So remember that was our position and vibration sense column. So if there is a lesion in the midline, this column is going to be affected. And if the lesion is above the medulla, the contralateral side will be affected. If it's below the medulla, the ipsilateral side will be affected. And vice versa for the corticospinal tract. If there is a lesion is above the medulla, contralateral side will be affected. If it's below the medulla, ipsilateral side will be affected. Now the third structure starting with an M is very interesting, but it's thankfully it's not a very complicated pathway. It's called MLF or medial longitudinal fasciculus. So this connects the third nerve to the sixth nerve, and there is a lesion there. Especially it happens in multiple sclerosis patients. There is going to be loss of lateral conjugate gaze. And the fourth M structure is the motor nuclei of 3, 4, 6 and 12 nerves. So remember these cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, 12, these are the multiples of 12. So all those numbers that go into 12 and are in the brainstem are going to have the nuclei lie in the midline. So you can see here 3 is in the midline, 4 is in the midline, 6 is in the midline, and 12 is in the midline. So this information is very helpful and very good to remember, because based upon this you can tell where the lesion is based upon what cranial nerve or what pathway is involved. So let's move on to this next rule of 4, which is 4 lateral structures. These are the 4 lateral structures that start with an S, and they are residing on the lateral side. So what are those? Well, the first one, very familiar, spinothalamic pathway. So that's going to be on the lateral side. So if there is a lesion anywhere in the brainstem on the lateral side, guess what? Loss of pain and temperature sense on the contralateral side. Spinocerebellar pathway, which we didn't really discuss, but this is the one that gives you the balance sense, and there is ataxia if this is involved. This is also going to lie on the lateral side. And then there is spinal nucleus of the fifth nerve. So the fifth nerve nucleus that carries the pain and temperature sensation from the face is going to be on the lateral side too. And then there is going to be sympathetic pathway, which if affected will give rise to Horner syndrome, which we all know is ptosis, meiosis and anhydrosis. So these are the rule of 4. So once we've kind of mastered in the rule of 4s, then it becomes easy for us to remember to figure out where the lesion is in the brainstem based upon the deficit that we see. So let's look at the brainstem real quick. So here is the midbrain, and you can see it is supplied by posterior cerebral and the superior cerebellar artery, and then there is posterior communicating and the interpeduncular artery, rami of the posterior cerebral artery. So this is just this quick vascular supply of the midbrain, and based upon whatever the artery is involved, if there is an arterial lesion, there will be deficit corresponding to the structure in the midbrain. Now here is the pons, and pons is supplied by the circumferential branch of the basilar artery. So the posterior circulation is supplying to the pons, and then the paramedian branches, and then the another branch from the basilar artery is supplying to the pons. Now the last structure in the midbrain is medulla, and you can see that the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is PICA, supplies to the medulla and the posterior part of the medulla. It is very important because this syndrome is very commonly asked in the exam, and it's called PICA syndrome. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the anterior inferior cerebellar artery also supplies to the medulla, and the anterior spinal artery supplies to the midline in the medulla too.